Hello and welcome to our latest coach learning video, and the topic we're going to cover in this session is around practice. So practice is something that we talk about a lot as coaches, and clearly one of our main jobs is to come up with ways for players to do practice, and so we're going to delve into this idea of practice and how it can help with learning and how it can help players get better. But also, as the question says there, is like, does the type of practice matter? So we're going to look into that a little bit as well. Just a little bit of context, and you might have seen this before on previous videos. So these are the main things that we might want to teach, if you like, or coach within netball or any sport really. So within this session around practice, I think we're going to certainly look at decision making here, technical and skills. We'll come into it, perhaps tactics and strategies as well. Not that the other ones wouldn't be in there at all, but I think they will be the main things that we're going to refer to as we go through. So at this point, it might be just useful to have a think about this. So I'm sure as a coach, you've got your favourite practice or practices that you would tend to use, your go-to session, if you like. I'm sure you've got something jumping to mind. So it might be just worth pausing to draw that out, or just think about it in your head if you've got it really clear, if you know what it is, and just think about what is it that the players are working on within that session. I'm going to show you quickly an example, and then it might be worth pausing after this just to have a think about that. So my example, this is a favourite of mine, and this is my main sport's football, and I would use it a lot in football, but I've also used this in netball quite a bit as well. And you can see the top right. This is a movement essentially practice, and it's about getting people to think also, which I think is important. Essentially, you can see there are basically three teams. In this case, triangles, circles, and squares. You've got to pass from triangle past to circle, circle past to square, square past to triangle, in that order. And then there are various things to then add in, that we can add in down that right hand side at the bottom there, different options type of thing. But basically looking at some of the things underneath around thinking two steps ahead, where to go, what distance and angles, and when do I add my timing of my movements and things like that. So it's a movement activity essentially. So there's one example. That's one that I would tend to use. It might be just worth stopping and thinking about, if you want to pause the video, thinking about your main practice, or one that you use a lot. So this might be worth checking out. You can pick it up on YouTube. So it's the World Cup final from 2015, and it might be worth just pick that game, or pick a different game, pick any game you want really, and pick one player and just follow that player for 5 minutes or so, and just see what things you notice, just to kind of give you where I'm going with this. If we look at Revalian, was a player I looked at when I did this exercise and analysed everything she did in 5 minutes. And you might have a guess as to what those numbers are, as to things that she did. So we've got 4 and 5 in brackets there, next to 4, something similar. And then we've got 76. So you might have a little guess at what they might be. So here we can see it broken down, and obviously there's 52 different things that she does here in the first 5 minutes, all broken down, analysed, and you may or may not have guessed that the 4 was passes. So you can see in red here we've got 4 different types of passes. So feeding the wing attack with the chest pass, a second option 5-yard overhead pass to the shooter, 7-yard chest pass square, and a 12-yard chest pass square. So 4 passes within open play. The 5 in brackets was to denote that there were 5 passes from a set piece. So I think most of them are centre passes and then 1 from a penalty. So obviously Valiant's the centre, she takes the centre passes, so that kind of adds 2. But I guess the point we made here is that there were only 4 passes that she made in 5 minutes of play. The 76 was decisions, so you can see that there's 52 things here that are worthy of saying this is something that she did, but in some of those there's more than one decision, if you see what I mean. So whether it be something like 27 setting up position and creating space might have involved a couple of different things as an example, and certainly the one underneath, so a 5-yard drive, receiving it above her head and turning with the ball. So different things where it probably involved more than one decision. So I guess the point being made here is that if we take the set pieces out of it, and obviously that's part of the game, but she only actually did 4 passes. So how much time do we spend practicing passing as opposed to practicing decision making? As an example, if we're making 76 decisions in 5 minutes, is that more important to focus on and think about how we practice that as opposed to doing the passing? So let's have a look at some different types of practice. The first one we're going to look at is blocked practice. As you can see, blocked practice is where we would practice one skill and do that in a block. So that might be a block of, say, 10 repetitions would be a typical thing we would do in sport, where we do 10 bounce passes all in one block. So we do one after the other up to 10, and then we might pause, move on to the second topic or skill, which might be chest passes. So we then do 10 chest passes, and then we move on to a third block of, say, overhead passes. So I'm sure that you recognise that type of practice or have experienced it or probably done it as a coach. So kind of opposite to blocked practice would be interleaving, and there are 2 forms of this really, so either serial or random. So interleaving is where we mix up the skills within a session, and the difference between serial and random would be that serial would be in a set order. So it might be that we do 1 chest pass followed by 1 bounce pass followed by 1 overhead pass, back to chest pass, bounce pass, overhead pass. So you kind of know what's coming, and it's like a series, but we are mixing them up. The difference with random then would be a little bit as the topics are kind of put along the bottom there, and the colours, that order would be random, and it would be totally mixed up, and basically you wouldn't know what's coming next. So a random practice, it could be that we start with a chest pass, then there's a bounce pass, there might be another chest pass, an overhead pass, back to a bounce pass. So you don't, it's all mixed up, but we might still be practicing those same 3 skills or types of passing, but we're actually mixing them up in a total random order where we don't know what's coming. If you think about a game, so I think a game of netball, that replicates that. So a game is random, so a netball game is random, so we don't know what's going to happen next. So it might be that if we go back to Revalian, she's on the move to try and receive something, she's trying to get free, she may or may not receive the ball, so there may be a catch to do or not. She might need to change direction again before she gets the catch. Obviously you might then, once you've caught her, you're probably going to pass it or shoot in netball, but then there will be a certain type of pass, and then again, depending on what happens there, I might need to move or I might not need to move. I might have thrown it away and I might be defending. So in that sense, netball is random. So to bring this to life, we're going to have a look at a couple of videos. We're going to use the videos throughout and see what you recognise. So if we just play this first one, so you can see the practice, and I'm guessing that you recognise this practice. It's a popular one. we see quite a bit in netball. So just have a think about whether that's blocked or is it interleaved, and if it's interleaved, is it serial or is it random? So if we just look at the second video, so think about what's happening in terms of what's coming up and the order of things, the way that they're being practiced. So random or serial or blocked. So don't know what your thoughts were, but I think we've got what we've got here. We haven't got blocked. I think the blocked example was what I gave before, where you would definitely and clearly practice the same skill over and over again and then move on to the next one. So what we had, I think, in the first 4 corners practice, we had a good example of serial practice where you run and then you receive it from a certain position, you catch it, then you quite quickly pass it straight off, and then you run again to the other end of the queue. So every time you do something, every time you're involved, you go through that same series of skills in that order. So to run out into the same spot, basically, where you receive the ball from the same spot, basically, and then you pass it to a person in the same position. So a good example of interleaved but serial practice. The second one you can see was much more random, so we didn't really know what was happening there. So for any one player there, they could have been receiving a pass, they might have been just trying to get free and not receiving passes. So there was getting free, there was receiving, there was passing, there was some people were defending again. Am I marking? Am I getting hands over the ball? Am I tracking someone, trying to mark them? Any of those sorts of things. But all of that happened randomly depending on what was going on. So more like a game type situation, if you like, a more random situation. So I think it's worth just refer back to your practice that you came up with at the start. It's maybe worth just reflecting on what is your practice. Is it blocked? Is it interleaved? Is it serial or random? Okay, at this point I think it's useful to just take a look at the difference between performance and learning. And this is something that I think gets in the way in general about practice and whether practice is effective, and particularly, like, in the end, we practice things to become good at something when we need it in a real life environment. So in terms of sport, in terms of netball, we're practicing in training or in coaching sessions in order to be able to do those things in a match, in a game situation. So the learning that we need to do is to become competent, more competent at doing the things that we're practicing in those coaching sessions, so that we are able to perform it when I need it most in a certain situation in a match. So we could talk about all sorts of examples here, but I think that what it comes down to is that what we often see in coaching sessions is actually performance. So sometimes, regardless of the type of practice we're doing, we see that players can either do something or not do something. But that's, at that time, as we're doing it, that's a performance. That's not learning. So it's not permanent. It's not a permanent change where I can do it whenever I need it months later. So if I've just done 76 passes, chest passes, and I'm asked to do another chest pass, I can probably do it. I can probably perform it quite well. But can I perform that chest pass in a game when I need to feed the shooter in between two defenders, whatever that scenario might be? I've got a tall player in front of me. Can I do that? All right, and maybe I can, maybe I can't. But I think what we just need to get our heads around this as coaches, that actually quite often we think that people are practicing for match situations or for the long-term learning, and actually what we're seeing in one-off coaching sessions or in a certain practice might just be performance. So if you've ever said, oh well, they can do it in training, why can't they do it in a match? Well, actually this might be a useful thing to look into a little bit more and think about, well, are they actually learning this, or is it just a temporary performance that they can do it because they've just done loads of it? And like we said before, a game isn't like that. A match is random, and we need to be able to perform skills in a snapshot when it's needed in probably a different situation to what I've ever done it before. So to build on that, if we go back to this blocked practice and interleaved practice, if we only ever do blocked practice, and I know that people wouldn't do that, but if we only ever did blocked practice, where we're only I'm doing my sets, if you like, I'm doing my chest passes, and then I'll move on and do some bounce passes, and that might not transfer well into that game situation in terms of longer term learning. And basically we could go into the research. I don't think there's any point here, but the research tells us that blocked practice is good for performance. If you do blocks of, again, if you do, think of a shooter shooting. If they do blocks of, I'm gonna just put 20 shots in from this point here where I'm stood now, you'd expect to see, particularly as they go on and on, they might miss a couple to start with, but once they get into repetition, 16, 17, 18, 19 and 20, they're probably going to get them in because they've just done 15 shots from that exact same place. So if we only ever do blocked practice, then that looks like they're doing really well and that they're learning, but that's this idea of that it's just performance. So will they be able to get that shot in when it matters in a match? And basically what the research says is that actually no, and that longer term learning is quite negative from that type of practice. As opposed to this idea of interleaving. So if we interleave, and particularly with random practice, and it's not rocket science, this, so we're basically saying let's make the practice as much like the game as possible. So if the game's random, let's practice in a random order. Now there's all sorts of reasons why that might be good for learning, but I think the other thing to consider here is what happens with random practice, particularly more so than serial practice actually, because in serial practice we know what's coming next, whereas in random I don't, so the decision making bit's harder. So what happens with random practice is the performance is actually quite poor. So you might be doing stuff in if we just take that second video that we just watched, where it is random, we might see lots of mistakes there in a coaching session, but actually by making those sorts of mistakes and working through it in that way, the decision making practice that we're getting particularly is just one thing, improves, and what we tend to see is that performance in a coaching session might be poor, but when we put that into a game situation or into something months later, if we're coming back to it and practicing that thing again, then actually we see greater returns on long-term learning. So this brings us to this question of, right, well, when do I use these types of practice? So I'm not saying never use blocked practice, but I think you need to know why you might use blocked practice and when to do it. So there's some obvious ones around. If you're introducing something for the very first time, you might do it then. Depending on the skill level, we might do it with more novice players in certain situations. It might be like in order to achieve success. So reasons why we would want them to achieve success blocking would be a good thing, to focus on one thing at a time. So back to that shooter, if there will be good times and good reasons for a shooter to do blocked practice, for sure. Rather than throwing in all of the having to get free, getting marked, getting bashed by a defender, receiving, then catching the ball, turning and doing the shot, rather than interleaving some of those skills into it, sometimes actually just doing some shots from a certain place might be actually really quite useful for lots of different reasons and lots of returns, if you like. So it's worth considering what they might be and when you might do that. But again, it's also worth considering, particularly with this reference to performance and learning, that when you might want to use random or serial practice. And again, that would offer you some different returns for different reasons. So it's not a defined always do this or do this only on this occasion or in this situation. These are things for you to work out and think about. So when would you block? When would you interleave your practice? Right, next type of practice is constant practice. So I'm going to put in blocked and interleave aside for a second. So this is constant practice is about the variables involved here. So I think you can kind of see from that picture there that actually they're probably stood whatever distance that is apart. Let's just call it 7 meters, and they're probably going to do a bunch of, in this case it looks like overhead passes, but the variables are constant, i.e. I'm passing it to the same person, there's no defender in the way, I'm this distance apart, it's a straight pass, and so nothing changes in terms of the variations that could occur within that sort of pass. So I'm not only practicing passing, but the variables are basically the same here. So linking this into, we're going to look at the same video. If you look at this one, so back to 4 corners, if you think of the variables, are the variables the same? Do I run the same distance? More or less, yes. Do I receive it from the same place? Yes. I more or less catch it in the same kind of way every time I do it, and then the pass is the same, on the end is the same as well. It's a straight one. So we'll just run through that again just to see. So running in, I catch it from that person to the right of me there, and then I run and I pass it out to someone, whatever distance that is, 3 or 4 yards in front of me. So that all the variables of the things that we're doing here, so we said this was an example of serial practice, but it is also constant practice, because the run, the movement, if you like, the catch, the pass, all have this are exactly more or less the same in terms of how I practice those 3 things. So the difference would come with variable practice here. So I think it's obvious that variable would be where the variables are mixed up. So I might still be doing that, practicing my passing, but actually every time I do a pass with variable practice, some of the variables might change. So that could be loads of things. It could be different distances, as we've talked about. So every time I pass it, then we've maybe got to move, and therefore the next time I do a pass, it might be a slightly different distance that I'm passing it. It might be on a slightly different angle as well. If the person is on the move who I'm passing to be fair, as you can see in the bottom left there, that would offer lots of these variables. So again, are they moving towards me? Are they moving away from me? Are they moving on an angle? Then if we if we could put in all sorts of different things around whether there's someone in the way, is there someone in front, a defender, whatever whatever it might be. I might need to loft it over somebody or around somebody. And again, thinking about where on court, all of those things. I need the sideline, or anything like that. So variable practice is something where practicing the same thing, the same skill, but the variables are altered. So again, if we just look at this one, we can see that if we take passing as an example, that every pass here, so someone in blue there has done it's passed it across. We'll just run that through again. Just look at the blue top, receives it, passes it forward there. Right, obviously there's some mixed in. Just take the passing as an example because there is another one here. I'm going to pass it across court on a diagonal. So we've got variations, and if we could look into some of the other stuff around the movement as an example, where have I got to move to, how have I got to receive it? So we might look at some of those skills and how they're done, but actually doing different variations of the same skill. So have a think about the practice, your practice. How much are of the skill that you're practicing, how much are you doing that in the same way, with the same conditions, and how much are you offering variability? So how much of practicing that skill, slightly different parameters in terms of some of the things we talked about, even just different distances, angles, all that sort of thing that can make it different. If we're talking about passing in terms of where does the pass come from, where does the pass have to go to, where does it have to go over or under or around something, all of those things. I think you can kind of see that it's a similar thing to the blocked and random stuff, that similar findings have been found in research around that constant practice, if we just do that, if we just nail that one, and in those conditions, time after time after time, repetition, that's really good for performance at the time, but that might not translate that well into longer term learning in the match in 2 months' time when I need to do that pass under pressure. Whereas offering lots of variability, has been shown to be poor for performance at that time. Maybe not as fluent, maybe more mistakes, that sort of thing. But again, actually is better for building longer term learning because I'm getting more experience. I think this is a good one to see that by doing different variations of the same skill, if I get experience of doing different angles, different distances, and if you think about in a match, you probably never do the exact same skill twice, so it gives me a better. So basically, we're guessing. Like when we're in a match and we're deciding what sort of a pass to do, we're guessing, but we can make informed guesses if we've got lots of previous experience of lots of different variations of that skill. So I can make a guess if I've done lots of longer passes, shorter passes, those sorts of things. So just bringing it back to my example that I showed previously. So the 3 teams passing in order, but thinking about movements and the where to go, when to go types of ideas, and that's linked to also then that determines the type of pass that might need to be made as well. So lots of thinking, lots of decision making in this around this movement. So I want this to be, and it is more of a variable practice, where basically everyone's interchanging, intermoving. So we have there would be more players than is on the diagram there. We might have 3 on each team, if you like, or more, and on purpose that people are interchanging positions, moving across each other, because that's how it works within real situations. So we get lots of different ways of, first of all, moving, but then receiving, different places, in different ways, and then obviously passing in different ways and different distances, angles, all that sort of thing as well. So again, think about when would you use constant practice, when would you use variable practice. So again, we're saying that sometimes constant practice doesn't have as good results in terms of longer term learning, but there can be times where some constant practice of the same thing, that repetition of the same variables can be useful, but also that variability of practice can be very useful, particularly in game sports like netball, where we need to eventually make those decisions that we've been talking about. So it might depend on some of the things that we're trying to work on. Are we working on, back to the start, are we working on technical things? Is it more tactical? Is it more decision making? Is it more physical skills, athletic skills? So again, that might lend itself at times to some forms of constant practice. Okay, so the last pair of types of practice that we're going to look at. So we're starting with massed practice. So this is the timing of when we do the practice. So massed practice is where we keep going. So we will keep practicing the skill all in one go. There won't be any period of rest. It's repetition, repetition, repetition. Whereas distributed practice, or sometimes called spaced practice, is where we would have rest intervals in between the periods of practice. So we can look at this in two ways really. So that like within a session, you could mass all the practice together without periods of rest, and then kind of, I guess it's getting into that blocking idea that we would do all that all in one go, and then we might move on and do something completely different, but do it all in one go. So if it was more distributed, then we might practice one skill, but we build in some rest periods in between. And then keep practicing that same skill and maybe have another rest interval before we do another bout. So let's just say three blocks of practicing the same skill, but actually we've split up those 3 blocks with 2 rest periods in between, rather than doing one big block of 3 sets, if you like. Some of the advantages that can come with that, so the rest might allow time for A, physical recovery, B, like the mental rehearsal kind of thing, or going through it in your head, taking stock, reflecting, potentially talking it through, so as with a coach, with other players, in order to try to improve. So it could be done in that way, but the other way, where spaced or distributed practice has lots of evidence for the longer term learning, so back to the performance versus learning argument, that actually that can also be done where the rest period is like in between sessions as well. So the traditional thing of, we're working on passing this week, and then next week we're going to be doing defending, and the week after that we're going to move on to a different skill set altogether. And then when we eventually come back to passing, we've probably, those performance levels will have gone down. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, alright, but it's worth thinking about how do we space out our practice periods of certain skills. How do we come back to it? How do we revisit it? Because actually forgetting those things and not being able to do it right now, so again back to this idea of performance, so the performance illusion is that if I can do it right now because I've just done all those repetitions, whereas if we space things out and come back to it in a couple of weeks, that tests the learning, the real longer term learning, but that's now more difficult for me to replicate or to put it into action properly but that desirable difficulty that you get through it being more difficult to recall is actually really good for the brain in terms of its learning and how we learn. So that those effects can be actually quite good. So spacing out that practice across several periods can actually be a good way to put things together. There's an added bit here with just to throw in as like sleep is thought to be a good thing in all of this as well. So just like even if it's the next day, if you're working every day or coming back to it next week, certainly can be beneficial. So again, worth considering about maybe not necessarily the one practice that we thought about before. Potentially it might be about how you tend to set that up, but do you tend to include rest periods within that practice, or your practices with a purpose, and trying to spread them out? And again, in terms of the scheduling of what you're doing week to week, in terms of your overall long-term planning, how are you distributing out practicing certain skills? And again, it's worth considering when might we do either of these. So again, it's not that MAST is wrong, because again, there might be situations or things that you want to work on where you want to just do MAST practice and that's it. But also there might be other things that you want to work on where you want to spread it out and distribute the practice across either several sessions or several blocks of work within a same session with rest periods included. So that brings us round quite nicely, I think, back to this, and I think it's important to just always consider this as to where we're coming from, and lots of these different things that we might want to be teaching or coaching, they might impact upon the types of practice that you want to do. So we've given examples all the way through there. So whether you want it to be massed or distributed, all right, that might, if you're actually trying to get some social or psychological outcomes, then that might be slightly different whether you want decision making outcomes or technical outcomes. And the same with the other types of practice. As I've outlined, there's evidence from research that suggests some of those types of practice tend to give us better outcomes for the longer term learning, which surely has got to be an important thing. And I think it's important to say here that some of those findings are a bit counterintuitive. So some of the stuff I talked about in terms of that performance can be an illusion, and when we see that people are doing it well, that would normally be a thing that we'd say that, well, that's great in a coaching session, but actually there's a danger attached to that is that performance, or is that because they've actually learned it? And so how do we test the learning? And that last bit we talked about, spacing or distributing practice, can be a good way to do that. So how often and how long do I leave it until we come back to that and try it again? And how much am I doing that in order to test that learning, if you like? Because again, like, do we want to leave it till the match where they really need to be able to do it to test whether they've learned it or not? So all sorts of things to consider here, and some of them will come from what is it we're trying to achieve here. So I think it's worth considering what the research tells us, but there will be times where all of those things, like constant practice, like blocked practice and mass practice, don't tend to suggest that overall long-term learning is as good. But actually there are lots of examples, and we gave some throughout here, depending on the outcomes such as these that we want to achieve, that actually that can still be good, and it's if thought through properly. So I guess that the usual message is that here's some things to consider. How does it work in my context, and when would I do this and when would I do that, and in what situations with my players, with my team that I'm coaching, when would I do some of these things, and when would I do it the other way. So I hope that's been useful and interesting. Always happy to hear any feedback, and look forward to the next one. Thanks very much.